Welcome to the deep dive. Today, we're going to be tackling a topic that's been generating a ton of buzz lately, and that is gluten.
Gluten.
Yeah, you actually sent us a YouTube video titled Revelado el secreto del pan, debes dejar de comer pan, el gluten inflama tu cuerpo by Dr. Carlos Jaramillo, wanting to learn more about gluten and its effects.
Awesome.
And it's pretty wild to see the gluten-free everything craze these days. You know, Dr. Jaramillo even showed like gluten-free TVs and soccer balls in his video.
Right.
So have you ever wondered if going gluten-free is truly a health necessity or just another fad?
There's definitely a lot of noise surrounding gluten.
Yeah.
To help you separate fact from fiction,
Yeah.
let's define what gluten actually is.
Okay.
It's a protein found in wheat, barley, and rye, and it's what gives bread its chewiness.
Okay, so that's where we find it. But Dr. Jaramillo mentioned something about rice that I found interesting.
Yeah.
Can you clear that up for us?
Absolutely. So
Yeah.
Dr. Jaramillo mentioned rice containing gluten,
Right.
but that's actually a misconception. Rice is naturally gluten-free.
Okay.
But what can be tricky is something called molecular mimicry.
Hmm.
So foods like corn have molecules that are structurally similar to gluten,
Oh, wow.
which can then trigger a reaction in sensitive individuals.
Interesting. So it's not just the classic wheat, barley, and rye we need to be mindful of, but also the potential for these mimickers out there.
Exactly. And this also brings up cross-contamination.
Okay.
So oats themselves are gluten-free,
Right.
but often they get processed in facilities that also handle wheat,
Oh,
leading to traces of gluten.
I see.
And this is a major concern for individuals with celiac disease,
Right.
which is why gluten-free labeling is so crucial.
Okay, let's dive into celiac disease since you brought it up.
Okay.
From what I understand, it's a serious condition where the body basically attacks itself when gluten enters the picture, right?
That's a good way to put it. So celiac disease is an autoimmune disorder,
Okay.
and it affects roughly 2% of the population.
Oh.
When someone with celiac disease consumes gluten, their immune system launches an attack against the small intestine,
Oh, wow.
and that leads to damage and a host of immediate, often debilitating gastrointestinal symptoms.
Wow.
We're talking severe diarrhea, bloating, gas, and more.
Wow. That's definitely not just a mild tummy ache. So how is celiac disease diagnosed?
Yeah.
Is it one of those tricky ones to pinpoint?
Diagnosing celiac disease usually involves two methods.
Okay.
The first is an intestinal biopsy,
Okay.
which looks for damage in the small intestine.
I see.
The second is a blood test that looks for specific genetic markers called HLA-DQ2 and DQ8.
HLA-DQ2 and DQ8.
Yeah,
And these markers predispose individuals to celiac disease.
precisely. So it's important to remember that not everyone with these markers develops celiac disease,
Okay.
but the vast majority of people with celiac disease do carry these markers.
Okay.
And for those with celiac disease, a strict 100% gluten-free diet is not a choice, it's a necessity. They have to be hyper-vigilant about even hidden sources of gluten, like in toothpaste or lotions.
That's incredibly important information, but celiac disease isn't the only way people react to gluten, right?
You're absolutely right.
What about gluten sensitivity?
Yeah, so gluten sensitivity is actually more common than celiac disease, but it's also less understood and often harder to diagnose.
Okay.
And unlike celiac disease, gluten sensitivity is dose-dependent,
Okay.
meaning the more gluten you consume, the more likely you are to experience symptoms.
So it's not a black and white, you have it or you don't kind of thing.
Right,
It's
yeah.
more about how much gluten you can handle before things start going south.
Precisely. And the symptoms of gluten sensitivity can be delayed,
Oh, really?
sometimes appearing up to 72 hours after eating gluten.
Whoa, that's a long time.
Yeah.
You could eat something on Monday and not feel the effects until Wednesday.
Yeah.
No wonder people struggle to connect the dots.
That's one of the biggest challenges with gluten sensitivity.
Yeah.
And the symptoms are incredibly diverse, ranging from gastrointestinal issues
Yeah.
to skin problems, brain fog, joint pain, and more.
Okay, so if someone suspects they have this sensitivity, how do they go about figuring that out?
Yeah.
Is there a test they can take?
Unfortunately, there's no single definitive test for gluten sensitivity.
Okay.
One approach involves assessing intestinal permeability,
Mm.
as gluten sensitivity is often linked to a leaky gut.
Okay.
This can involve carbohydrate tests that measure sugar absorption
Mm.
or immunological testing like food sensitivity panels,
Mm.
which can show if your immune system is reacting to gluten.
So a bunch of red flags popping up on a food sensitivity panel
Yeah.
might be a sign that gluten is a problem.
That's a reasonable conclusion.
Yeah.
It could indicate a leaky gut, which might be linked to gluten sensitivity.
Okay.
Now, Dr. Jaramillo in his video brought up an interesting point about modern bread compared to the bread our ancestors ate.
Yeah, that caught my attention too.
Yeah.
Is there a real difference between those types of bread?
There's a definite difference in the type of wheat used.
Oh.
So in the Americas, much of the bread is made with genetically modified GMO wheat. This GMO wheat produces a different kind of gluten than the non-GMO wheat you'd find in Europe, for example.
Fascinating. Could this be why some people report feeling better when they switch to organic bread or sourdough bread made with non-GMO wheat?
It's possible.
Okay.
Research on GMO wheat and its potential impact on gluten sensitivity is still ongoing.
Right.
But anecdotal evidence suggests that some individuals do better with those alternatives.
Interesting.
Yeah.
Dr. Jaramillo also linked chronic inflammation from gluten to a whole host of health issues.
Right.
We're talking skin conditions like dermatitis and psoriasis, respiratory problems, gastrointestinal distress, even hair loss and liver toxicity.
Right.
Is there a connection there?
It's important to remember that chronic inflammation can impact the body in many ways.
Yeah.
And while gluten isn't the only culprit,
Sure.
it can be a contributing factor for susceptible individuals.
Right.
What Dr. Jaramillo highlights is the potential for gluten to be a piece of the inflammatory puzzle.
So it's not about demonizing gluten entirely, but understanding that for some it might be a significant trigger.
Exactly.
Now, before we wrap up this part of our deep dive, I know Dr. Jaramillo made some pretty bold claims about gluten.
Yeah.
But are they all true?
Not necessarily. There are a lot of myths circulating about gluten that we need to address.
All right, let's bust those myths wide open.
One common misconception is that gluten is inherently bad and should be avoided by everyone.
Yeah, it seems like gluten-free has become the default for a lot of people, even if they don't have any specific issues with it. What's the reality there?
The truth is it all boils down to individual tolerance and the amount of gluten consumed.
Okay.
Some people digest gluten without a hitch, while others experience negative effects.
Right.
It's definitely not a one-size-fits-all situation.
So avoiding gluten unnecessarily might not be the best approach.
Right.
Now, what about this link between gluten and autism that's often mentioned? Dr. Jaramillo touched upon that in his video, too.
Right. That's another myth that needs addressing.
Yeah.
While there has been research suggesting that gluten-free casein-free diets might help manage symptoms in some individuals with autism, there's no conclusive evidence to say that gluten causes autism.
Okay.
Autism is a complex condition with various factors involved.
So it's not a direct cause and effect relationship, but rather something to consider exploring, potentially in consultation with a healthcare professional if you're dealing with specific symptoms.
Exactly. It's about personalized approaches and informed decisions.
Okay.
Now, since we've covered the myths, let's shift gears and talk about finding your balance with gluten.
Okay, so let's get practical. If I'm listening to this and wondering, do I need to ditch gluten entirely? What's the best way to figure that out?
Well, if you have celiac disease or confirmed gluten sensitivity,
Right.
then yes, a strict gluten-free diet is absolutely essential for managing the condition.
No question there. But what about those of us who aren't sure? Maybe we suspect gluten is causing some issues, but haven't gotten a diagnosis. What would you recommend?
In those cases, an elimination diet can be very insightful.
Okay.
It involves removing gluten completely from your diet for a period of time, maybe a few weeks,
Okay.
and closely monitoring how you feel.
Okay.
If your symptoms improve, it could be a sign that gluten was indeed playing a role.
So it's like a little experiment to see how your body responds without gluten in the picture.
Exactly. And then you can slowly reintroduce gluten and pay very close attention to how your body reacts.
Okay.
This can help pinpoint your personal tolerance level.
That sounds like a sensible approach. Listen to your body and let it be your guide. But what about people who don't have any diagnosed sensitivities? Do they need to worry about gluten at all?
Even if you don't have a diagnosed sensitivity, it's still wise to be mindful of your gluten intake.
Okay.
Moderation is key. Opting for higher quality sources when possible, such as organic bread or sourdough bread, might make a difference in how you feel.
So it's not about becoming gluten phobic, but rather being aware and making informed choices that align with your overall health goals.
That's a great way to put it, and I appreciate that Dr. Jaramillo emphasizes enjoying life and not being overly restrictive with your diet.
Yeah.
Food should be pleasurable and not a source of constant stress and anxiety.
Absolutely. Now, before we move on, can we circle back to gluten sensitivity for a moment? You mentioned that it can be tricky to diagnose. Why is that?
There are a few reasons why gluten sensitivity can be challenging to pin down.
Okay.
First, the symptoms can be so diverse and often mimic those of other conditions making it difficult to isolate gluten as the culprit.
So it's like a chameleon of the digestive world masking itself as other issues.
That's a great analogy.
Yeah.
And remember those delayed symptoms we talked about?
Right, right.
That makes it even harder to link back to gluten.
Yeah.
You might not experience a reaction until days later, and by then you've likely eaten numerous other foods,
Right.
making it tough to pinpoint the trigger.
That makes a lot of sense. Are there any other factors that contribute to the diagnostic challenges?
Another challenge is that there isn't a single gold standard test for gluten sensitivity. We talked about the tests for celiac disease, but those don't apply to gluten sensitivity.
Right.
We often rely on symptom evaluation, elimination diets,
Okay.
and sometimes tests for intestinal permeability to get a better picture.
So it's more of a detective process, gathering clues and piecing together the puzzle.
Exactly.
Yeah.
And it often involves collaboration between the individual and their healthcare provider to really get to the bottom of things.
Now, earlier you mentioned something called leaky gut, which can be linked to gluten sensitivity. Can you elaborate on what leaky gut actually is?
Of course. So leaky gut, also known as increased intestinal permeability,
Okay.
refers to a condition where the lining of the small intestine becomes more permeable than it should be. Imagine the lining of your gut as a tightly woven net
Okay.
designed to allow only properly digested nutrients to pass through. In a leaky gut, this net develops larger gaps, allowing undigested food particles, toxins, and bacteria to leak into the bloodstream.
Okay, so it's like a security breach in your gut letting things through that shouldn't be there.
That's a great way to visualize it.
Okay.
This can trigger inflammation and a cascade of immune responses leading to various symptoms throughout the body.
And how does gluten fit into this leaky gut scenario?
Well, research suggests that gluten can contribute to leaky gut by increasing the production of a protein called zonulin.
Zonulin? That's a new one for me. What does it do?
Zonulin acts like a gatekeeper,
Okay.
regulating the tight junctions between the cells lining your gut.
Hmm.
Think of it like the security guard at the entrance of your gut lining.
Okay.
Gluten can trigger zonulin release, loosening those tight junctions and increasing intestinal permeability.
So gluten essentially tells the security guard to relax the rules a bit, letting more things slip through.
Exactly. And that's how gluten can contribute to a leaky gut, potentially leading to inflammation and a range of symptoms.
This is all so fascinating, and it really highlights the complex interplay between food, our gut, and our overall health. Now, I know we've been focusing mainly on gluten, but you mentioned that other factors can contribute to a leaky gut. Can you give us a few examples?
Absolutely. Things like stress infections, certain medications like NSAIDs, and even an imbalance in the gut microbiome can all play a role in increasing intestinal permeability.
The gut microbiome, that's another area where there's been so much research lately. Can you briefly explain how the gut microbiome relates to gluten sensitivity and leaky gut?
The gut microbiome is a complex ecosystem of trillions of bacteria living in our digestive tract.
Okay.
When it's balanced and diverse, it plays a crucial role in digestion, nutrient absorption, and immune function.
Right.
However, an imbalance in the gut microbiome, often referred to as dysbiosis,
Okay.
can disrupt gut barrier function and contribute to leaky gut.
So it's like having an unruly crowd in your gut causing chaos instead of a well-organized community working harmoniously.
Exactly. And research suggests that gluten can actually influence the composition of the gut microbiome, potentially contributing to dysbiosis and leaky gut in some individuals.
That's incredible. So it's not just gluten itself causing issues, but its impact on the entire ecosystem in our gut. This really underscores the interconnectedness of everything in our bodies.
Absolutely. And speaking of interconnectedness, there's one more dietary aspect I'd like to touch upon that's relevant to gluten sensitivity. Have you heard of the FODMP's diet?
I have. I know it's often recommended for people with irritable bowel syndrome,
Right.
IBS. What's the connection to gluten sensitivity?
FODMPs stands for fermentable oligosaccharides, disaccharides, monosaccharides, and polyols.
Okay.
They're short-chain carbohydrates that can be poorly absorbed in the small intestine,
Okay.
leading to fermentation by gut bacteria. This can trigger symptoms like bloating, gas, and abdominal pain, very similar to symptoms experienced by some people with gluten sensitivity.
So if someone is experiencing those symptoms, it could be gluten, it could be FODMAPs, or it could even be both.
That's right. And it's why working with a healthcare professional is so important to help decipher what's going on and develop a personalized approach.
Right.
Sometimes individuals who are sensitive to gluten also find relief by reducing their intake of high FODMA foods.
It's like solving a mystery, eliminating suspects one by one until you find the culprit.
Exactly. Now, before we dive into personalized approaches, I want to address another myth that often comes up in relation to gluten.
Okay, hit us with what myth are we busting this time?
This one revolves around the idea that if a little gluten is bad, then a lot of gluten must be really bad.
The if a little is good, more must be better mentality. We see that in so many areas of life.
Exactly. And when it comes to gluten, that's not necessarily true. Remember, we talked about gluten sensitivity being dose dependent.
Right, the more you eat, the more likely you are to experience symptoms.
Precisely. But that doesn't mean that loading up on gluten-free products is the answer for everyone.
I can see where the confusion comes in. If gluten-free is healthier, wouldn't eating more of it be even better?
It's not quite that simple. In fact, many gluten-free processed foods are often higher in refined carbohydrates, sugar, and unhealthy fats to compensate for the lack of gluten.
So swapping a regular cookie for a gluten-free cookie doesn't necessarily make it a health food.
Exactly. It's crucial to read labels carefully and choose gluten-free options that are also whole grain, nutrient-rich, and minimally processed.
So it's about quality, not just quantity, even within the gluten-free world now. Before we move on to personalized approaches, I want to touch upon one more aspect that I found intriguing in Dr. Jaramillo's video. He mentioned the potential for non-celiac gluten sensitivity to resolve itself over time if the gut is given a chance to heal. Is there any truth to that?
That's a great question, and it's an area where more research is needed.
Okay.
However, there's some evidence suggesting that for some individuals with non-celiac gluten sensitivity, removing gluten for a prolonged period,
Okay.
allowing the gut to heal and inflammation to subside, might lead to an improvement in symptoms and potentially even a gradual increase in tolerance over time.
So it's like hitting the reset button on your gut and giving it a chance to bounce back.
That's a good analogy. It highlights the importance of focusing on gut health and supporting the body's natural healing mechanisms.
This is all so insightful. It really paints a much clearer picture of the complex relationship between gluten and our health. So now that we've covered the science, the myths, and the nuances of gluten sensitivity, let's talk about putting this knowledge into action.
Let's do it. Personalized approaches are key to finding what works best for you. So let's break down how to approach gluten based on what we've learned today.
Okay.
First, if you have celiac disease, the path is clear. A strict, lifelong, gluten-free diet is essential. There's no room for experimentation there.
Right, that's non-negotiable for managing celiac disease. But for those with suspected or diagnosed gluten sensitivity, it gets a little more nuanced, right?
Exactly. If you've confirmed a gluten sensitivity, maintaining a gluten-free diet is likely the best way to keep symptoms at bay. However, some people find that they can tolerate small amounts of gluten occasionally without triggering a major reaction.
So it's about finding that sweet spot, that individual threshold where gluten doesn't cause problems.
Precisely, and this is where those elimination diets we talked about can be incredibly valuable. They help you identify your unique tolerance level and guide your choices moving forward.
What about for those who suspect they might be sensitive but haven't gone through the testing process yet? What would you recommend as a starting point?
I'd suggest starting by keeping a detailed food journal, track everything you eat, and any symptoms you experience, noting the timing of those symptoms as well. This can reveal patterns and potential connections between gluten consumption and how you're feeling.
So it's like becoming a detective of your own body, gathering evidence to see if gluten is the culprit behind the scenes.
That's a great way to put it. And if you notice a consistent pattern of symptoms emerging after eating gluten-containing foods, it's worth talking to your doctor about further testing.
Now, let's say someone doesn't have celiac disease or a confirmed gluten sensitivity, but they're still interested in exploring how reducing gluten might impact their health. What advice would you give them?
I'd encourage them to think about their motivations for reducing gluten. Are they hoping to improve digestion, boost energy levels, reduce inflammation, or simply experiment with dietary changes? Having clear goals in mind can make the transition easier and more sustainable.
It's like setting an intention for any lifestyle change, right? Knowing your why helps stay motivated.
Exactly. And then it's about making gradual, sustainable changes rather than going cold turkey on gluten overnight. Maybe start by swapping out conventional bread for sourdough or exploring gluten-free alternatives for your favorite pasta dishes.
So it's about finding a balance that works for your individual preferences and lifestyle, not about deprivation or strict rules.
That's the key. And remember, even within the gluten-free realm, not all products are created. Equal focus on whole, unprocessed foods as much as possible, and be mindful of added sugars, unhealthy fats, and excessive sodium in some gluten-free processed foods.
So read those labels carefully and choose wisely, even if it says gluten-free on the package.
It's exactly. Now, beyond dietary choices, there are other lifestyle factors that can play a role in supporting gut health and potentially improving gluten tolerance.
Okay, let's talk about those. What are some things people can do beyond their plates to nurture their gut?
Managing stress is huge. Chronic stress can wreak havoc on gut health. So incorporating stress-reducing practices like meditation, yoga, or spending time in nature can be incredibly beneficial.
So it's not just what we eat, but how we live that impacts our gut.
Absolutely. And prioritizing quality sleep is another crucial factor. When we're sleep deprived, our gut microbiome can become imbalanced, leading to digestive issues and potentially even increasing sensitivity to gluten.
I know, I certainly don't feel my best when I haven't slept well. It affects everything.
It truly does. And finally, don't underestimate the power of regular physical activity. Exercise helps stimulate digestion, reduces inflammation, and supports a healthy gut microbiome.
So it's a holistic approach, really. Taking care of our mental, emotional, and physical well-being all contributes to a happy, healthy gut.
That's a great way to summarize it. It's not just about eliminating gluten. It's about creating an environment where our bodies can thrive.
Well, this has been an incredibly insightful deep dive. I feel like we've covered so much ground, from the science behind gluten to practical tips for managing sensitivities and supporting gut health. What are some key takeaways you hope listeners will walk away with today?
I hope listeners feel empowered to make informed decisions about their own gluten consumption. It's not about following trends or fearing food, but about understanding how gluten affects your body and making choices that align with your individual health goals.
I love that it's about personalized nutrition, not a one-size-fits-all approach. And if someone is struggling with gluten-related issues, what would be your final piece of advice?
Don't hesitate to reach out to a healthcare professional, especially a registered dietitian who specializes in gut health. They can help you navigate the complexities of gluten sensitivity, interpret test results, develop a personalized meal plan, and provide ongoing support.
It's so important to remember that you don't have to figure this out alone. There are experts who could help you on your journey to optimal gut health. Well, on that note, I want to thank you for sharing your expertise with us today and for helping us demystify the world of gluten. It's been an absolute pleasure.
It's been my pleasure as well. Always enjoy these deep dives.
And to our listeners, thank you for joining us on this gluten journey. We hope this deep dive has provided you with valuable insights and inspired you to take a closer look at your own relationship with gluten. Remember, it's not about restriction or fear, but about finding what works best for you and your unique body. So until next time, stay curious, keep learning, and
keep those deep dive requests coming.
we'll see you on the next deep dive.